So hello everybody and welcome to this week's podcast. I'm very, very excited for this one. This man, Rich, he is a depth of wisdom and knowledge all around the psychedelic sphere. So to give you a little bit of an introduction, Rich is an educator, therapist, and a musician with 18 years of experience working in the field of mental health. He's worked as a mental health and addictions crisis worker, case manager, psychotherapist, and psychedelic therapist. He currently teaches and offers supervision privately and through Therapsil, a Canadian non-profit that advocates for and teaches Psilocybin-Assisted Psychotherapy for end-of-life distress. Rich is passionate about advocating for community organization, focusing his energy on psychedelic education, harm reduction, safe use, accessibility, and equity. He teaches about music and psychedelics, a area I'm so interested in, safe touch, psychedelic ethics, and enjoys writing and playing music on his off time. So Rich, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Amazing to be here. Thanks so much.
Great, man. So whereabouts are you in the world today?
Yeah, so I'm in Kingston, Ontario in Canada. So sort of in between the big cities of Toronto and Montreal, basically. So
Wonderful. Is that your main base at the moment?
It is, yeah. That's where I do most of my work and my community work. And then I do a bit of traveling here and there for different things, but this is, yeah, definitely my home base.
Oh, so Rich, what really got you into this area of mental health and working in the field of addiction? And then how did this kind of lead on to you working in the area of psychedelic therapy?
Yeah, it was sort of random circumstance that brought me to work in the mental health field. Like I find like a lot of people, they have their own, I mean, we all have our own stuff, but a lot of people, they get into it to kind of like figure out themselves. Whereas I took criminology at university because my dad was a cop. So I feel like I knew that world a little bit, but I didn't want to be a cop. That was too much of a hippie. And so but I took criminology, and then what ended up happening was on my fourth year, you needed to do a placement. And I was kind of like, I don't really know what I want to do. But then there was this distress center where it was kind of like a crisis line call in place. And I was like, that could be cool. So I ended up going there. I got some training and I did that for my fourth year honors program. And then really that's what sort of got me into doing crisis work, because shortly after that, I moved to Kingston and I got a job on a crisis team, basically because of that experience that I had. And I really, I just enjoyed, looking back, I would always be just like chatting with people like out on the street. I would always sort of like be at that sort of same level where I had this compassion for people. It wasn't like I had this like sort of judgment towards people that were out, living on the street. I kind of, I guess, saw the humanity in them always. And I always wanted to sort of like support them in some way, and sort of see like the bigger, I think because of criminology, you sort of see like that bigger structural issue, like having this sociological lens. And so I got into the crisis team and I did that for quite a while, probably like, 13 years. But on my first day, I remember thinking, okay, so you have a psychiatrist, but you don't have a psychologist. And they're like, yeah. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. So like right away, I kind of saw like they were already sort of like medicating things more than working through things. And so, but that was my first day. But then, if you can imagine after 13 years, like kind of working in that pretty rigid box, that's essentially what got me into psychedelics, because I saw this sort of revolving door of, you get in, you get your medication, you go, you maybe deal with a few things or you get housing. And, but a lot of the underlying issues weren't being dealt with, like we learned about trauma informed. And so we learned, okay, most people that come through this door have pretty bad trauma, but we didn't have time or space to actually work with that trauma. And so it was very frustrating just to see that. And then so essentially that's why I ended up leaving and going into more of like my own psychotherapy practice so that I could work with people on sort of like a more embodied level, not just, sort of medicating them or sort of like symptom reduction, but instead doing more, like relational, somatic, deep work. And then that also led me into a bit of psychedelics. And so I ended up getting training in ketamine and psilocybin and cannabis, and then 3-MMC, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but It's sort of like MDMA. So I had all that training, and then so slowly left that job and did my own private practice, and then now I'm shifting even beyond private practice and sort of doing more teaching and more groups, supervision, and still doing my private practice a little bit, but less than when I started, for sure. So that's it in a
Mm.
nutshell.
Wow, wow, amazing. It's kind of like a really big problem in the world, isn't it? That we're really just treating these symptoms and not getting to the root causes of people suffering and trauma. And it kind of sounds like that's what you really experience working in that area. What's kind of maybe what's your kind of theory on this? People being traumatized or even addiction. People dealing with addiction and then just the symptoms almost just being managed.
Well, I think it's about I think it's so many things, right? It's about not having relationally aware parents sometimes, right? And so people who are traumatized and they have a kid, it's like, you know, we all try our best, but it's like we just can't hold that space if we haven't had that space held for us, right? So like in a way it's like the parenting and like the trickle down that happens. And then my teacher Sasha, he talks about system letdown, right? And so like people, they go to get help for like depression, for example, and in a way they're misdiagnosed because he would see depression as like these suppression mechanisms in the body, right? Like these shutdowns of like survival mechanisms. So like if you had abuse and you had to shut that down, that shutdown gets stuck in the body. And so you go to the
Mm,
doctor and you're like, I'm depressed. And they're like, oh, here, take this antidepressant. You'll be fine. It's like a chemical imbalance or whatever. And then the person doesn't get better, and then they think, okay, there's something wrong with me, and so they go and they try another medication, right? And then like so this like system letdown, I think, is like a big piece of it, is we're not seeing this bigger picture of like what's actually happening with people. We're just seeing it as like, okay, this DSM has symptoms and it has this diagnosis, and so then I'm going to medicate them with this. And in a way, but once again, it's not to blame the system. It's like people are burned out because there's just so much mental health and all that and addiction, and there's so much stuff, and then it just gets into this like tight space, and it's like, well, what can we do? All we can really do with the time we have is offer these like kind of really short term services, or we could medicate people and we can just hope for the best, and so in a way it's I think it's like burnout, it's lack of sort of like holding and lack of like relationally aware culture, and like lack of sort of like compassion and connection, and that all contributes to like these lack of human needs that we have, which are like to be seen and to be held and to be like okay with having emotion and these like very human reactions to things like grief. Instead it's like, oh, I don't want to see that, I don't know how to hold that myself, so like you need to put that away. Like what doctor, of course with a few people, as like some can, but a lot of doctors that I know and a lot of doctors I've seen, it's like they can't hold space for those emotions. Like they can't be in the room and be okay with like big emotions, because they're not really trained for that. They hardly have sort of bedside manner when they're doing giving medication or you know supporting people at the hospital and stuff. And so that relational piece is missing, right? And of course, we don't have time for that. And so I'm not saying, once again, it's like it's a system thing, and it's a multi-generational
mm,
thing, but there's a lot there. And that's why I had to leave the place, because I was like, I can't take on the system. I can't like fix this myself. So my focus just became, how do I just like support the grassroots and like support small groups of people around me? And then that's where I feel the difference can be made. And like, yeah, maybe of course you can do little shifts in the broader scheme of things, but it's really about like, what can I do with my small network of people here and like relationally support them and just be attuned to them and normalize their human experience. And that in itself can be healing, because it's permission to like feel and be human, right?
mm. Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like this emotional capacity is almost missing in the medical system. And that kind of quote comes to my mind about, Gabor Mate says, Ask not why the addiction, but why the pain," getting kind of kind of in touch with these deeper emotions, this suffering, this pain, and being there more on a human level. And why do you think psychedelics? Why do you think they're like becoming such a big treatment now for people? Is it because of the practitioners maybe have more emotional capacity to hold that space? Is it the psychedelics inherently in themselves? Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I always say about psychedelics is like, they're not inherently good or bad necessarily. They're just powerful. And so yeah, it depends on the practitioner, it depends on the person. But like in saying that, I think what psychedelics can do is it can get to a deeper root of the issue, right? So instead of like shutting something down, they actually bring things up, right? And I love this quote from Stan Groff. He says, a symptom is something halfway out. And so it's like, okay,
Mm.
I'm feeling this sadness, and if I can see it as sadness, almost that I'm getting handed, by my inner child, like they're handing me this sadness to feel in my adult body and to like really let it move through my body, because my body knows how to work with it. But when I was maybe 10, I had to shut it down because I was told maybe like by my parents, like, don't cry, and so I shut it down. So that gets stuck. But then on psychedelics, especially, I can't remember if it's Paul Stamets he talks about it, but mushrooms are composters, and so
I love that.
they're going to go and they're going to find the things that need to sort of like be composted, right? And so like if there's sadness or grief, then that's going to come up and it's going to kind of wash over the person and be felt, and then it's gone, right? Like that layer of grief is now out of the system, and there's more space for like ease and whatever other sort of like facets of essence we want to sort of call in. And so I think that's the difference, is that they bring things up versus our system and our sort of medication. It shuts things down. So it
Mm.
doesn't necessarily need psychedelics, but I think like when I do work with people somatically, I'm doing that with them. I'm like going to the thing that they want to avoid, and I'm helping them build tolerance for that discomfort. And then they're letting their body move through it. And it's usually like, titrated, like little pieces at a time. It's not like, let's go into like 100% of that grief that you felt when your father passed away. It's like, let's go into like a percentage of it and see how that feels in the body and get to know that and let that move through. Right. So I think whether it's psychedelics or more of just like a different framework of like
Yeah.
trusting the body, I think that's what psychedelics bring. And I think that's what I think that's why I think people are needing they're like, okay, this isn't working. And so I need something else. And they're turning and they're seeing all these articles on psychedelics and they're like, okay, well, let's
Yeah.
try that. And,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I really, it brings me so much joy to hear that, how you approach it, because I really feel like in a lot of these kind of, I suppose, new practices people are partaking in, breath work and psychedelics and, other somatic practices. There's this kind of idea that we need to go into this huge catharsis. We need to go 100% into the wound and, blow ourselves open and release it. But like that can actually really re-traumatize people a lot, can't it?
yeah. Yeah. I always try to distinguish the difference between processing and catharsis, right? Like catharsis, it feels good and it's like a big thing, and it looks like, oh my God, this is really big healing. Like look at how big this healing is. But actually processing it's slower, it's mindful, and it's sort of like it's more sort of like with the sensations in the body, right? So I could punch a wall, and that'd be cathartic. It'd be like, okay, I've got anger in my chest and I'm just like blowing that into the wall. And then the anger in the chest actually doesn't really move. It just explodes for a second. Whereas if I go into the anger and I really kind of like get to know it, and it's like, oh yeah, it's like, it's red hot and it's sort of like steamy and it's sort of boiling in my chest. And then if I stay with it, then naturally what can happen is it'll start to move a little bit. And if I stay with that and I sort of like, it's like, oh yeah, now my shoulder's really tense. I'm going to stay with that. And then it kind of moves down my arm. And, this takes a little bit longer than punching the wall, but like I stay with it. And then eventually maybe I'm kind of like, I'm making a fist and then I'm pushing against someone's hand and I'm kind of releasing that out of my chest. And then there's a big layer there that's actually moved versus like this cathartic thing that actually didn't do anything. It just gave me a feeling of blowing off steam for a second, right? So that's a big difference, is like the processing is really slow and mindful. And yeah, it's like, I think it's because of our culture. It's like, well, if you didn't heal unless you went to Peru and like got eaten by a jaguar and like, did this like huge ayahuasca thing and you have a big story to it. Whereas this guy, Christopher Solomon, he works a lot with salvia, and his whole thing, which I love, is he says, if you're present in the moment during the healing, then you don't need a story. Like you're there in that moment, and that's all that matters, right? Like just mindfully being in the body while healing's happening. Then you don't even have to necessarily have a story or remember it, because it's like forgetting you ate. It doesn't mean that you're going to die from starvation, right? So
Mm.
the body will remember that. So I think that's a big piece that's also kind of missing is yeah, let's go for the big, because that must be what healing looks like.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. Like you put it so well there. And then what do you kind of think? Because trauma work's been around for a long time, and a lot of people are starting to understand. Trauma's stored, held in the body. What are the kind of the unique benefits now that psychedelics can offer this space? When people want to process and work through trauma.
Yeah, I mean, I think like similar to before, it gives you like different access to things. And then I think it depends on the medicine. So with psilocybin, for example, it's often like it's almost like it helps to build people's container to be bigger. So it's like, okay, usually, when I'm in this body, it's like it feels overwhelming. But if I can feel a sense of my boundaries dissolving and I can become part of, nature or part of the earth, then yeah, of course, like this piece of trauma can be held in such a bigger container. And I feel like there's,
Yeah.
with the plant medicines, there's sort of this like intelligence that can be supportive. So it's almost like you have this well grounded and attuned parent that's there being like, it's okay, like you can go into this, like I'm holding you, right? And so I think that's part of it, is it gives you that. And then of course with something like MDMA, it's, you're like sort of shifting, you're kind of turning off the fear center of your brain. And so what you would normally find distressing, you can actually hold more of, and it gives you more access to memories and things like that. And then with cannabis, it's really good because it actually softens the fascia in the body. And so it releases sort of like held energy that's in the body. And sometimes people don't even have a story of like what that is. It's just more like, oh, I was like shaking and I moved a lot of sort of stale old energy out of my body and I just feel lighter now. Right. So I think
Mm.
it's that supportive container that the medicines can bring. And then yeah, they kind of work as like a bit of a magnifying glass of like, okay, this is the thing that you need to look at in order to, continue to be unfolding into more wholeness in your journey.
Mm, mm. Wow, wonderful. And yeah, you kind of touched on what one of my next questions was going to be around this kind of idea of like what the different gifts or medicines of each psychedelic can bring, and you kind of very eloquently put it there. Kind of building our emotional capacity, actually relaxing the body, releasing energy. This kind of non-specific amplifier effect. Bringing whatever's needing to be looked at to be looked at. What would you say about maybe some of the other psychedelics, like any insight into, ibogaine or ketamine or maybe 5-MeO?
Yeah, I mean, ibogaine, I don't know. I've never worked with ibogaine. I know that I think it hits a similar receptor as salvia, and so if it does, then it sort of hits like the colostrum, which is I guess like the um, sort of like where our kind of reality gets put together, like so I
Yeah.
think ibogaine definitely can be like a life altering thing, and it's a bit of an ancestral medicine, I believe, too. And so I think like, and then physiologically it can help with like opioid addiction. And so physiologically, when people are done with that, they don't have that. And then I think you still have to work through kind of like some of the psychological stuff, but with the journey you've had already, like this sort of like awakening of maybe your place in sort of like a larger sort of like tree, of like ancestry and like kind of connection to more of like the cosmic map, I guess. So yeah, I don't know much about ibogaine. But what were the other ones you mentioned? Oh, ketamine. Yeah.
Ketamine.
Yeah, ketamine is I mean, it's interesting because I've got some beef with how ketamine's used in a lot of like clinics and stuff, especially here. They just sort of hook you up, leave you, so they don't really treat it as a psychedelic. They just treat it kind of as like a, pharmacological intervention. And so they're not really taking into account like that malleability and like kind of the ethics of like if you're using a substance like that. But I think ketamine can give you like a reset. I think it can be really a powerful medicine. I also think that once again, when you're dissociating someone a little bit from their body, there's a lot of a need to bring in like protection, like psychic protection, because if someone has trauma and they're kind of leaving their body, and this could be like, depending on your way of looking at the world, like that could leave room for things to come into the body, right? Or that could like kind of add to more dissociation. So, but I've learned some really interesting protocols with ketamine that can actually help with dissociation and kind of like help to retrieve dissociated parts that have, for whatever reason, kind of like left the body due to trauma. And I've had a pretty interesting ketamine experience. So, but yeah, so ketamine, I think it's got potential. I think it's sort of being co-opted by once again that system we talked about earlier, where it's just sort of being used as like a real
Yeah.
quick and easy, like don't worry about integration or preparation or psychedelic ethics. Let's just get them in and kind of hook them up to that. So I think ketamine, yeah, I'm careful with ketamine and I don't really work with it, but I have trained with it and it does have potential. And then what was the other medicine that you asked about?
5-MeO
5-MeO.
DMT.
Yeah. Yeah, another one where I'm kind of like, I see where it's going and it can be like, I've done a low dose and I find that was really beautiful. Like doing a really low dose, I think the way I was introduced to it is there's like a handshake and there's a hug, and the hug is like the kind of breakthrough, you know, non-dual kind of, big kind of God experience or whatever. I did the handshake, which basically just I stayed in the room, and I think that was quite valuable actually because I didn't get to blast through all the things. I kind of got to just be there with it and sort of like get to know it a little bit. And for me, like when I'm talking about medicines, it's really about relationship building, So for
Mm.
5-MeO, it's like I wanted to get to know it. I didn't want to just like go and see the freaking like altar of God or whatever, I didn't want to just like blast away. It can be a really big spiritual bypass medicine, I think, but also can be quite a beautiful healing medicine. So once again, it depends, I think, on the practitioner and the person and the intention and like how reverent the people are being with it and things like that. Because yeah, I've heard of some stories where the people just got blasted and then they just had to took them 3 years to get their sort of self back together again because it just sort of blasted them through their whole personality structure. So, but I think it has potential to sort of connect us with something beyond ourselves. It's kind of like, okay, but then it's kind of like Alan Watts says, it's like if once you get the message, you can hang up the phone. You don't necessarily need to go back to
Yeah.
5-MeO to be like, I just need to make sure that God is there, or I just need to make sure that I'm one with the universe. It's like, how do we do it once and then be like, okay, I definitely that can now inform the way that I live my life and I can bring that into my body and I can learn from that. And I don't have to go next weekend to like make sure that it's still there. So that,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of beauty in it, but I have some concerns with just how some of it is being used, because it can be a big, yeah, bypassy medicine, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's so refreshing to hear that, because, a lot of these compounds or I believe spirits have, massive potential for transformation, but there's also huge potential there for kind of using them with the wrong intentions or not in the correct or sacred way or just avoiding, some of the most obvious kind of preparatory things that one should do and let alone not having someone there to help you integrate the experience. So what do you kind of where do you kind of stand with helping or guiding people on a preparatory process to work with psychedelics? And then maybe you can speak into a little bit around maybe managing people with having intense emotional experiences?
Yeah, so prep for me, it's about, it depends, it'll depend on the medicine, of course. So getting them to know a little bit about how, and it's funny because it's like, how do you have informed consent with medicine, right? It's like, if someone's never done psilocybin, how do you like truly have them consent to like having psilocybin? It's like,
Yeah.
so you try to describe it as much as you can, but for me, it's important for them and for the practitioner to have like, what I guess they call like spiritual intelligence, right? So knowing, like, having some maps of like sort of the cosmos, whether it's from, a different culture or from the culture they're from, but something that can explain where they might go. Because if not, then there's going to be like this ontological shock, which is just like, I just went somewhere that in my framework doesn't exist. And so it kind of shatters my reality, right? And that can be really debilitating and hard to sort of integrate, right? It takes more time. And so for me, it's like preparing them for that by giving them either maps to sort of navigate within, or building their capacity to like move different consciousness, like, so like to be able to meditate and stay with that meditation and kind of come back, right? Or to do some breath work and kind of, move into that process and sort of like come back, right? So for me, it's about, building that skill set. Daniel McQueen, he's the guy, that a lot of, he often says, setting, dose, and skill, and I think the skill set is often neglected in like this sort of trifecta of like setting, dose, because yeah, skill can be part of the set, but I think it's important enough to put on its own kind of like little branch. It's like, if someone does 5 grams of psilocybin and has never done a belly breath before and doesn't know how to ground their energy or how to like, be mindful of their thoughts, that's going to be a lot different than if someone takes 5 grams and is like able to, breathe into their belly and, ground their energy and like orient to the space and sort of, you know what I mean? Like, so skill set is what I often will work on, is like, are you able to regulate your nervous system on your own? Do you have a few
Mm,
resources that you can pull upon? And for me, resourcing, it's like, it's got to be in the body too. So really like
yeah.
embodying that resource. What
Mm,
else? And then it's about like trust building too. Like, I want them to know me. I've had a woman before where she's like, "Well, Rich, I trust you." Like, it was on our first call together, and I was like, "That's great. You think you trust me, but like, I don't even know you yet." And so she's like, "I'm comfortable with you studying me," and I'm like, "Well, no, I'm not comfortable with that yet, because I don't know what I might represent to you when you're on the medicine, right? I could suddenly become the dude that, like a perpetrator or something, or I could suddenly become your father, or, because these transference and countertransference are very sort of like more potent in the medicine, right? And so
totally.
doing that prep to kind of like move through some of that and understand like what, because yeah, I could represent her dad, and if I know that that's happening, we can really use that, right? And I can kind of like work with that enactment. But if it's sort of more of a, like on an unconscious level, then that's where it becomes tricky, because then, we're moving into these enactments unconsciously. So yeah, a lot of like prep with that, like building rapport, building trust, expectations of what could happen, and just normalizing all of the things that could happen too. Like, not saying you're definitely gonna be doing this, but it's like, well, if you have a headache tomorrow, or if you have a headache after the medicine, that's totally normal, and if you're shaking a bit on the medicine, that's totally normal. Just so that if something's going on, they can be like, oh yeah, Rich said this is normal. Okay, I don't have to like get too into my head about it and worry about if something's wrong, right? Because
Yeah.
that's like the last thing
Yeah.
you want. Um, so yeah, so that's mostly what I would do, is just building rapport and trust, building the skill sets, building like kind of expectations, making sure that they have a good safety net for when they're done, because if they don't have any support, then it'll be like, well, let's work on that first, right? Because
Hmm.
you need somebody who's safe in your life, because I can't be the only person. You can't like call me, every day to be like, oh, this revelation's coming and I'm realizing this and that. It's like having a safe community is better than just one person, obviously, but that's why I really try to emphasize like community integration circles and things like that. Because I think that's like a really it's more informal, and it just feels like more traditionally what would have happened. Like
Yeah.
traditionally they wouldn't be like, I'm going to go and talk to this one person and do this thing, and then I'm going to come back to my community and feel isolated and not be able to talk to anyone about it. It's like, so trying to figure out how do these medicines actually, how do we bring sort of like some of the ancient wisdom into our more modern container, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the more that people kind of find the others, I always say, on the treat, so you get out there and find the others. And I love that you're so passionate around. I can even hear it in what you just talked about. Is this kind of idea of like really ethics in the psychedelic space, and when working with psychedelics, trying to, fully inform people around, yeah, what might happen, what might not happen, and the preparation, building up this kind of rapport as a therapist, as a facilitator. One of the areas that I wanted to dive in, well, one is kind of like, yeah, the kind of ethics issues in the space, because I feel like, it's an evolving process at the moment in the psychedelic sphere, around, the correct ethics in a kind of Western context. And then because the ethics in more of a ceremonial and indigenous context are very different of what we think is ethical, and what, the power structures and balances in those kind of different traditions. And then, so maybe we can start with that. And then this idea of consensual touch in the space and therapeutic touch is an area I'm really fascinated by, to help support people, ground people. So I'd love to, yeah, maybe tackle those two kind of areas with you.
Those small pieces. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and like, so yeah, ethics is, yeah, for me, a passion, like psychedelic ethics, and talking about it, and kind of, yeah, like holding people accountable to it, like, cause so there's lots of different angles to come at it. But Kylea Taylor, she wrote The Ethics of Caring, and it's a really good book, and it brings a lot of cool stuff in that I often will bring into like when I'm teaching this stuff. And a big one for her is like, the needs and the fears of the therapist or the practitioner, right? So for example, and we can even relate it to touch. If I have like a need for touch in my life and I'm not getting that from like my life, then I might be more prone to, if someone needs touch in a psychedelic space, I might be more willing to offer that because I'm actually craving that too, right? And so that's a blind spot, and I'm more willing to kind of like go there because my need isn't being met in life, right? So that could be a need for intimacy, it could be a need for power or control, it could be a need for, money, it could be a need for lots of things. And then the unmet, or the fear as well. So maybe if I haven't worked through terror in my body, for example, and then someone starts to have terror in the space, then that's a fear of mine that I'm going to shut that down, or I'm not going to be able to hold space for that, right? So, or if I'm scared of intimacy and someone's on MDMA and they're wanting to like look at me like fully and like take me in, and I'm like, like I don't want to be seen like that, like, so I would shut that down or I would do something to kind of like, you know, maybe like, yeah, like, okay, I can't do this, so the unmet needs and the fears of the practitioner are really important to like look at. And it's not a bad thing. It's more, can I bring this, like, can I like leave this outside? Right. And can I recognize that, you know, where are the opportunities for this to maybe get me in trouble, right? Or kind of like make me vulnerable to that, because then I'm not being in service of the person, right? I'm actually imposing my needs or my fears onto this experience, and I'm not just letting it happen as it needs to happen, right? So that's one of the things, is like sort of that psychedelic ethics of that. Um, and then there's also like, she talks about the shared transpersonal space, right? And so like when you're holding space, as you probably know, it's like there's kind of this like contact high, like you can kind of feel really connected to the medicine. And that also is something to keep in mind, because maybe you're like the boundaries are a little bit more malleable, and it's like, oh yeah, like I feel like I'm on the medicine with this person, I feel really connected. And so once again, how do you stay grounded and sort of still in that professional capacity while still sharing that transpersonal space, right? So it's like, yeah, maybe some emotions coming up and like, oh, that's amazing. Maybe some emotions are coming up and it's too big and you're weeping and then they're having to take care of you, So it's like, where's the line where, okay, I can be authentic and I can be human and I can be holding this space and witnessing this person, but I'm also not getting, once again, in their way, right? I'm not shifting the container to me, right? And then there's lots around, power dynamics and like just the malleability of the space and like, how do I not impose my needs? How do I not impose my boundary or my like the ways of interpreting the thing? And then there's like these things like these enactments that we could do, right? Where, for example, the one that I talk about with touch is, if you think, okay, I'm the professional, I know what this person needs, and I have a sense that they need me to put my hand on their shoulder to like, to relax them or whatever. And then you ask them, is it okay if I put my hand on your shoulder? Right there, there's this huge power dynamic of you're a professional. They might fawn, right? They might fawn into that and say, yeah, of course. Like, but maybe their body's saying like, this person isn't safe right now, even though it's like, okay, I know that this person's safe, but in my psyche, they're representing, someone else. But then they might be like, yeah, that's fine because they're fawning, and because you're in sort of this more position of power, even if we try not to be, we try to be on that same level. We're still in that sort of like power dynamic, right? And so just as an example, like we can get, and it's not like those situations are like, I'm not putting them in the same category as like, these really bad sort of boundary violations, but these are really subtle things where it's like, oh yeah, shoot. Like there could be some times when I've asked someone something and they said yes. And like, it could have been that their whole body was saying no, but they didn't know how to say no because we didn't do that conversation before. Right. So then coming into touch, what I do with touch is, and I teach this, it's like a 2-day thing that I do. And some people, they're like, whoa, like at first they're like 2 days to talk about touch, like, wow. And then like the last time I did it, this woman came to me and she was like, it could have been 3 days. And I was like, I know. So
Mm.
what I do when I'm going to use touch in a session, especially with MDMA, because like with MDMA, you kind of have this more like, kind of your boundaries are sort of like lowered, right? And you feel more connected to people and safer. And so, you might ask for things more than you would when you're not on MDMA. And so especially with doing MDMA, what I'll do the day before is a thing that this guy, Sasha Cuff, taught me. It's called Navigating Safe Touch. And so, and I demoed it in the Netherlands at the Fellowship of Psychonauts thing. And it was pretty powerful, I think, for people to see. So you basically, like long story short, it's a titrated approach to embodied consent. And so I would stand at the other side of the room and I would get the person to sort of like find their yes and no in their body and really explain to them like what I just said to you, like, hey, you might say to me, like you might think in your head, like, well, Rich is safe. I know Rich is safe, but it's no, it's like, listen to your body. I'm not going to take it personally if you're like, you know what, Rich, not right now. And it's like, okay, great. Because I know that I can represent things to people and it's not necessarily me. And so I can wear that projection and not take it personally because I'm doing my work. I'm not going to be like, oh my God, well now I feel rejected. And I'm like, oh, you don't want me to touch you? Okay, fine. I'll just stay over here. I won't even bother helping you. You know what I mean? Like there's so much that could, even if that's just internally. Right. And so we get the yes and no in the body as their kind of compass. And so that's what we're going to use as the yes and the no to when I ask them, can I, do you want me to step a bit closer? And then, the safe touch is basically the person is there and then I'm across the room and then we play with, okay, where do you want me to go? Do you want me to take a step closer? Do you want me to make eye contact? Do you want me to get lower to the ground? And like we play with proximity, we play with like, turning away and stuff like that. So by the time I get close to them, we have this real embodied sense of like, okay, Rich is like, yeah, I feel really safe with him. And the end result isn't even necessarily touch. The end result is to get that embodied feeling in the room, right? And then we can
Mm.
maybe practice some types of touch and be like, okay, so, there's some containment I might do. Like, how does that, let's try that if you want it. We can do that. And how does that feel? We can do like a hand holding and how does that feel? So kind of practicing the things that we might do. And then in the session, when touch is happening, it's so much deeper, right? And it's so much more embodied and so much safer because we've already done it without the medicine. And then, the whole thing with touch is that, you can always take away consent on the medicine, but you can't add. And so we always talk about that too, of like, okay, you're going into an MDMA session, you're saying you don't want your hand held, but could you imagine, this comes back to like, how do you give informed consent of something that you haven't had before? And I'll say, can you imagine, depending on like how this medicine can show up in your system, that you might actually want a hand. And so if you say no right now, then we can't do it. But if you say, Rich, there's a possibility that I might want it, and if I do ask for it, then it's okay. Then it's like, okay, good. Because then I'm not put in a position where someone's on MDMA and they're like, I want my hand held. And it's like, sorry, I can't because we didn't decide on that. It's like, do I make the decision to break the contract of consent, or do I decide to provide that need that they're asking for in this really vulnerable state? And so it kind of puts you in this weird, like, shoot, I'm going to make the wrong decision no matter what. Right. So I try to, as much as I can, like go through those things beforehand so that it's very clear about what they're asking for and how we're going to navigate that. So yeah, that's the touch thing in a nutshell. And there's lots of uses of touch, and it's very powerful, but I think it can be a very problematic thing, because once again, the intuition of the practitioner might be that this person needs whatever. And for me, intuition's a bit tricky too. It's like a bit of a, it's a patience game. It's really waiting and not acting on it right away. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
I love it. I think this area of touch, is pretty hot. It's a pretty hot topic, I think, in the psychedelic sphere. I've been to some conferences, and people talking around, what types of touch we can use, and I think even in the rejection of the MDMA, I think there was like stuff taken out of context around supportive touch in the space. And you know I know for me, in some of my own experiences, somebody just like having pressure against me with a pillow against my hips, when I'm experiencing pain coming out of them or trauma coming out of them,
Yep.
was so profoundly deeply healing. And then also being held in the space. I've been lucky to have had experiences with friends, and just being held in a very safe manner was profoundly healing for me. And I think some of the big experiences I see for people around touch is maybe people experiencing this kind of therapeutic touch when they haven't experienced any safe touch in the past. And those kind of clients are obviously a little bit more challenging in terms of maybe sexual trauma or abuse, but touch can be profoundly healing, can't it?
My gosh, yeah. Yeah, it's such a like an unmet need for a lot of people, right? And so to be able to have safe touch with consent and with like embodiment, yeah, like, and when you say, yeah, when you said like the pillow thing like that, that's often what I'll do too, is it's like, well, I could put my hands on this person, but why don't I just use this big pillow and like, yeah, bring a bit of pressure. And then it's like touch without touch in a lot of ways, right? It's not like you have sort of skin on skin. You've got all these other ways.
Yeah.
So using things like that can be really helpful as like an alternative to just having your hands sort of on the person. So containment can be so good, just like supportive, like like mindful, very minimal touch can just be so powerful, and being held. There's even this type of touch, I don't know what I would call it, but it's basically like you're sort of almost reenacting like a childhood wound where maybe mom wasn't well enough to hold the baby, right? Like mom was just too anxious, and so what we do is mom gets anxious, like like, so my co-sitter would be like unable to regulate, and I would help to co-regulate mom, and then mom would then hold baby, and then I would support mom from behind. And so you basically have like this reenactment of like this really healing. It's like, oh my God, like dad is supporting mom, and so in the sort of relational field, that can be
That's
really
incredible.
reparative. Yeah. So it's super cool. And it feels really like, I don't know, it just feels neat, because it's like, that it's like,
Mm,
okay, we're in a therapy session, but in a way you kind of also know that there might be this unmet need that's being sort of like rewired in the system, right? Because when we're in these really malleable neural states and we get this new information in, then it doesn't matter if we know that it's not real or not. It gives the nervous system new information, and it's like very potent. And I've felt it myself. I've like felt things happen in my brain where I'm like, whoa, the thing that person just said literally like rewrote that whole thing in my body, like this relational wound. And it was like, wow, so yeah, there's really cool ways to use touch and like proximity, like even bringing protection for people and like standing by the door and like, like notice in your body what happens when I stand here and I just sort of like, look out for you, and you don't have to watch, like, you don't have to look at the door. You can just slowly, and then they'll be like, oh my God, I can finally relax because I don't have to like be this hyper vigilant kid watching the door to make sure that I'm safe. It's like, this adult, I've got you. I've got you right here. And I'm going to like make sure that no one can get in. Like that can be just like so powerful too. I've seen it many times be big, like really big for people. And that's not
Wow.
touch, but that's just using proximity, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of like rewiring the nervous system almost, isn't it?
Totally. Yeah. It's giving new
Mm.
information. It's like you go into the imprint of the wound, right? And then you offer new information, and then that tells the person like, oh, this wasn't like about me being bad, or it was like, oh, it was like, this is what it would feel like if the adults in my life were relationally healthy, and so it
Mm.
takes away that sort of like that shame. So a lot of times there's like a big emotion that comes up after, and a lot of grief and a lot of like anger and all that stuff. And it's like, yeah, bring that up, like let's let that come through. There's safe ways to process this stuff. And then like
Yeah.
the first thing I learned as a psychedelic therapist, because I had a friend and like mentor, she said, your greatest tool is your nervous system. And that's just like stuck
Mm.
the whole time. It's been, probably 10 years sort of in and out doing this work. And I always bring it back to like, if I can stay solid in the room and like regulate my nervous system, and if someone's going into a freeze and I can kind of like go a little bit into it with them and then regulate my nervous system, then that can show their nervous system how to sort of, because co-regulation is what a lot of people
Yeah.
didn't get, right? And if I'm
Yeah.
scared of going into a freeze, then I'm not going to be able to do that. So it's like, how do I continue to do my work and like move through these blocks in my system to be a more resilient nervous system? And then I've got a solid sense of like, I can hold this for the person, I'm not going to
Mm.
leave my window of tolerance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I love, the nervous system and, nervous system regulation and co-regulation is, yeah, getting a bit of a highlight, not only in the world of psychedelics, but also in, couples therapy as well, being able to, co-regulate each other and realize when you're at capacity and if you're free in freeze or fawn or fight or flight. I think it's just, yeah, it's a kind of a fascinating overlap now into the world of psychedelics.
Mm.
I'd love to segue a little bit into another pretty big, deep topic. I'm loving all the stuff you're interested in. You're nerding me out, but this idea of end of life psychedelic therapy and using psychedelics for people with a lot of like anxiety and distress around maybe coming towards end of life, or even people who have gotten a challenging diagnosis of say cancer. Maybe it's not even terminal, but using psychedelics to maybe find acceptance with these conditions or the end of life or this kind of bigger existential kind
Yeah.
of area that psychedelics can be used in. Yeah, I'd love to hear, what has been your work, because I know you're involved with Therapsil now. I think that's how you pronounce it. But yeah, I'd love to hear about that kind of space, because it's quite edgy, and I think it's quite unique. It's not really happening in Europe. Let's put it that way. I know the Canadians are always a little bit ahead, so I'd love to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. So it comes back for me again to like a cultural thing where it's like we don't have the maps to understand, death and dying. We're such like an age phobic culture that it's like, oh my god, any talk of death is like, I don't want to talk about that. And then yeah, like the news or the trauma of a terminal uh diagnosis, right? It can be like a shock trauma, or it can be like different type of trauma. It can also then bring up all this unresolved stuff, right? So it's not just like, oh, this one thing, this one diagnosis and the impact of that. It's more like, oh, the initial impact of this diagnosis and then all of the other things that aren't complete. And it's like, oh my god, and it brings up all these things, right? So when we're talking like end of life distress, we're talking about like potentially like a whole lifetime's worth of unresolved stuff compounded by this sort of like shock trauma that's in a container that isn't being able to be held in our culture, right? So it's like this sort of like there's a lot, So with Canada, we can do like a special access program is called, where someone can sort of like appeal to the government to get psilocybin for their end of life distress. And I think there's a couple different reasons why it can be helpful. One is just like the physiology of psilocybin. It's like got the anti-inflammatory. It's like a bit of an anti-anxiety, and so it's sort of like settling the nervous system, and it's sort of like not creating more harm to the inflamed parts of the body, if you will. Um, and then there's this, like I said, with sort of like the plant medicines, there's this sort of like larger container that's kind of coming in, right? Where it's like, oh, like if you do psilocybin often, it's sort of like, oh, like I am not just who I thought I was. Like I am more ancient than I thought I was. I'm part of something bigger, like this larger fabric, right? And so then often what I hear is like, well, like, yeah, I will not be here, but like a part of me lives on. Like it's like I'm not as scared now of death because I've seen where I go, and it's quite nice, you know. It's like it's familiar, you know, like my loved ones are there, you know. So it gives
Mm.
people that reassurance in a way where it's like you know you're not just sort of like, it's not just like a black, you know, a black screen after this. Like you're going to go somewhere, you're going to be held, you're going to be, you know, somewhere that you know, you've maybe been before. And so it eases that sense of like anxiety, right? And then what it also does is, as we know with psilocybin and other medicines, it's also then maybe helping you work through stuff that has been pulled up, right?
Yeah.
And it's helping you move through the grief of that, and the grief of leaving your family, or the grief of, you know, and the shock of that. And like, okay, how do I just process this, right? And so if we don't have the tools to process these shocks, or these like these big things that are sort of entering our lives, then it just overstacks our system, and we're unable to sort of be present because we're just sort of activated by it. So psilocybin has been, I think, the medicine that's mostly been used for end of life. Maybe a little bit of LSD. I know Aldous Huxley took LSD right at his time of death. So that's pretty cool. I want to do that. But yeah, I think it's an opening up of seeing. It's like it helps people to accept it because they see that it's not what they thought it was, right? And
Yeah.
so many cultures, they focus on preparing for death, right? Like they focus on, you know, how do we live with that in mind, whereas we kind of like avoid it, and so it gets compounded in our culture, I think. And yeah, I've worked with some people that really worked through like their childhood traumas that were being brought up by their diagnosis, right? And then also moving through then the news of the diagnosis, and like the grieving, and then they're more empty, like they're more light, entering into their final days, and they feel more complete, right? And more accepting of it.
Mm.
And so I think it's a beautiful medicine for that. And it's ethically, I feel like we almost like should, you know, I don't often say like, you know, everyone should do psychedelics, but it's like if there's one way that we should use psychedelics in our culture, you know, in a really mindful way, it feels like the end of life piece would be where we should start, you know,
Yeah. Wow.
um,
Wow.
as a gift for people, you know.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really fascinates me around, you know, coming to end of life, you know, and you know, I reflect on, you know, the death of my grandmother, and you know how I feel that she died with so much held in, and that stayed in the family system, you know. Whereas if someone has an opportunity to take psychedelics, it can actually ripple out and affect the whole family system, because the things that maybe weren't said, the trauma that wasn't resolved, the infighting, the, you know, all the family stuff that happens in families can, you know, can really be resolved with this person coming to the end of their life. And I think, you know, I'm so with you on that, that, you know, if there's an opportunity to like leave the rest of the family in a better shape when you leave, then I think that's amazing for not only the families but also for society as a whole.
Yeah, like I often say to people, you know, like, and you know this, you know, it's like no one is ever doing psychedelics for themselves, even if they think they are. You know, it's like we're doing it for our, sometimes like our lineage, right? Like, maybe some ancestors are getting a little bit of like, moving through a little bit of stuff through us. And then we're, it ripples into our family, into our friends. Maybe like, we were a little bit more friendly to the cashier at the store. And like, she goes home and it's like, there's this like really friendly person just made my day. You know what I mean? Like, so that it ripples in ways that we don't even realize, and like it's like these fractals or these mycelium, right? That we kind of like, that's, I think the secret of the mushroom is just like, it's the mycelium. It's like, we have these little pieces, these little cracks in our heart that open, and then we can just like send that out a little bit more to the people around us. And it just, and that's why I come back to the grassroots thing. Cause it's like, that's the big impact, is like the small gestures, the little mindful parenting pieces that we bring that maybe disrupts a little bit of that generational trauma for a few minutes, or maybe it breaks it fully open and it allows, that to clear, so yeah, we're never doing it on our own. Even if we're doing
Yeah,
it on our own, it ripples,
absolutely. I'm kind of, I know we're coming to the end. I can't believe it already. But one thing that we have there that also supports us is music. And having beautiful music from different musicians and different lyrics and different pieces from many, many years ago and indigenous cultures. Um, how do you see the role of music in psychedelic therapy?
Yeah, no big questions, eh? um yeah, I mean, so it's like, if people are doing the classic psychedelic therapy model, right, which is like, you're going inward, you have eye shades, you're sort of like just staying with the experience. Then if you think about it, the music is the only external stimuli, right? And so that, when we talk about set and setting, like that is like, that then becomes pretty much almost 100% of the setting, right? Because you're inward, your eyes are closed, and then it's just you and the music. So the music becomes this like, this fabric of the experience. And so there's a lot of power in it. And I think like it can be it can be used in a way that's like aggressive or pushing, kind of like in the sense of like, oh, I really want this person to work through this like trauma. So I'm going to put on this like really gnarly music, and kind of like push them into it. So with music, even, we need to be like non-violent, like, like kind of like pushing the edges a little bit, and kind of like, poofing, shaking the snow globe a little bit. But yeah, like being supportive overall, right? And the way that I work with music usually is, yeah, I improvise it. Like I'll kind of have a bit of a set list kind of ready, but I'll sort of improvise it, and it'll be based on where the room is. And so if it's like, okay, there's been a lot of emotion coming up and I've got this other, violin track coming up, it's like, maybe I'll let them rest, like maybe I'll put on like a little bit more of a piano piece, and then something I learned from Daniel McQueen is it really, really useful. Like he'll talk about like doing mini sets, so that, for example, like you're not in a psilocybin session and it's like, oh, there's a piano song, and then there's like a sitar song, and then there's a violin, and then there's a drone, and it's like, where the heck am I going? Like I'm going on like a world tour in 10 minutes, right? So instead, it's like, if you're putting a piano song on, play like 15 to 20 minutes of piano music, so that it's like, okay, I can settle into this sort of like continent of the psyche, and then, oh, and then there's a sitar coming in, and then I'm spending, 20 minutes in this sitar land, so it's not as jarring as just like going here, here, there, and then I also, so I do that, but then I also kind of do this where it's like, a little bit of movement, and then a little bit of stillness, and a little bit of movement, so that they can like move through something and then let it settle and then move through it. And that's just how I do it. And I've seen it done really well with live music too. Like I think there's a lot of beauty in having like live musicians there. I don't unfortunately do that yet. Or kind of have like the community here where I have a bunch of awesome musicians that I would trust to like, come into a psilocybin session, but maybe at some point. And when I do the stuff with the Fellowship of Psychonauts, there's often like a bit of live music, which is really beautiful. And it's where I'm seeing like that potential. And then what I've experimented with recently is doing, having lyrics at the end, like English lyrics, which I don't usually do, but I try that like at the very end, just to kind of let people know, like, okay, we're starting to kind of come out a little bit. And once again, nothing that's like, I've seen it done really poorly, like, like just really like obvious, like cheesy stuff where it's like, oh man, you're like totally trying to put this into their heads. But I think you can do it artistically and subtly in a way that really captures the moment while they're coming out, and it's like
Mm,
celebratory and it's like community feeling. And um, I haven't done it with one person yet. I've just done it with groups. Um, so that's I really like that. Yeah. So that I don't know
yeah.
if that
No,
if that answers some music stuff for you.
no, absolutely. I think it's, it's an area that really fascinates me. I know, is it Mendel Kalin, I think it is, and he has this, kind of spectrum of different genres from like chaos from like 1 to 10, and peacefulness from 1 to 10, peacefulness, and like working on this kind of graph of these different genres and how they can bring people into these different spaces to resolve different things. I know for us in our retreats, yeah, we've started to blend now, some of the playlists with the live music and then some lyrics, and
Ooh.
it also makes me want to step more into a musical role myself. I'm learning guitar now, and you're hoping to bring that energy. And yeah, I think it's wonderful that we have so many different varieties and options in the space. And I always love to hear some people say like, "Oh, I absolutely hated that song," and then some people are like, "That was my most favorite song." And it just, it's fascinating. Or how songs can trigger people, that was their wedding song and they've been divorced for years, or, you know, has some Lord of the Rings in there sometimes or something like that. And people are like, "Oh, that like it's my favorite movie and I just cried for Frodo," or something. I think it's a wonderful wonderful area to explore. And each facilitator has their own flavor.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's one of my favorite parts is like putting together a little playlist. It's just so fun, it's like a
Mm,
little gift that you're putting together. You're curating something for people, often based on who's coming and what the intention is, and sort of like, if there's any likes or dislikes, and then it's just sort of like, here you go. And then
mm.
it's quite lovely, yeah, to see it unfold in real time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it really is. Rich, I think we're gonna have to do round two. I think there's so much more I wanted to get into, but we're just at the hour. So I want to really, yeah, thank you for all the work you've done on yourself, man. It's so awesome to hear your knowledge and wisdom and your passion. You're like so passionate, and it's a pleasure to know you on a personal level. And yeah, have enjoyed some of the Celtic magic here in Ireland, Ishnok and that kind of thing. But yeah, I'd love to hear, where can people find out about your work, what are the projects you're working on at the moment? Um, you know, yeah, let us know.
Yeah, I've got like a website. It doesn't have a lot of psychedelic stuff on it because I'd probably get kicked off, but it's called Kingston Outside the Box .com. And so people can kind of like reach me there. There's also so on there I've got a couple, like I do like some sitters courses, and I'm doing like a safe touch thing. And then with medicinal mindfulness, I have a one of their electives is navigating safe touch, and so I'm doing that through them. So if you go to like, I think it's psychedelicshine.com, you'll see the safe touch one, and that's like some pre-recorded stuff and then a couple live sessions. And it's all virtual, so that one's like accessible to kind of anyone across the world, whereas the other safe touch things I do, it's usually in person, because it's nice to have that, like, um, and then I'm doing, yeah, like I'm involved with the Fellowship of Psychonauts. And so that's, we're doing another retreat in April after Breaking Convention. And so you can just search Fellowship of Psychonauts or look up Nurse Joe. Um, and yeah, you can find me on Instagram. It's at Jukebox County 15. Jukebox County is my band name. And so I just do all my stuff through that. My music is not necessarily ceremony music. It's more like pop stuff, but slowly I'm kind of like connecting those two worlds. I wrote a couple ceremony songs in the UK recently, and I was like, oh, this is fun. And yeah, doing an MDMA training next week in Canada. So that'll be the first one in Ontario with Therapsil. Looking forward to that. And then I'll be doing another one in, I think, February in Toronto. Um, I mean, yeah, I think I do a ton of other stuff, but that's basically it in a nutshell right now. Oh, psychedelic first aid and preparedness through this group Numa that I work with, or it's a business I started. And that's, yeah, we do them mostly virtual as well. So lots of fun stuff. Tons.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, tons of stuff. And yeah, I'll have most of those links then for people in the notes if they want to get in touch with you. And hopefully we'll get you here to Ireland, host a workshop next time you're going to be here, because I know you do a few trips here every so often. Rich, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And yeah, I look forward to doing another podcast again with you in the future, hopefully.
For sure, man. Thanks so much. Great questions, great conversation. Really happy to be here. So thanks so much.